of the analysis of the causes of social conflict. And as if this were not enough, near the very end of his life, he returned to his classical studies, translating all of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. He died in 1679 at the age of 91. From the various portraits and descriptions of Hobbes, we can tell he was a man of considerable charm. And I wish the book that we had his picture reproduction of his portrait on it. But I just want to read one brief passage from his biographer, a man named John Aubrey, who knew him. Who knew him. It was written during Hobbes' lifetime. Aubrey wrote about Hobbes, "He had a good eye and that of hazel color, which was full of life and spirit, even to the last. When he was earnest in discourse, these shone, as it were, as if a bright live coal within it. He had two kinds of looks. When he laughed, was witty, and in a merry humor, one could scarce see his eyes. And by, when he was serious and positive, he opened his eyes round. He was 6 foot high and something better," so it was very, very tall in the 17th century. "He was 6 foot high and very better. He had read much, if one considers his long life, but his contemplation was much more than his reading. He was wont to say that if he had read as much as other men, he should have known no more than other men." So his point was he had read a lot, but what was most important was his thinking. If he had read as much, he would know as little. Gives you a little sense of Hobbes' spirit, his humor, the wry wit that becomes apparent on almost every page of this book, but you have to be a careful reader. Hobbes was deeply controversial, as you might suspect, during his lifetime. Leviathan was excoriated by almost every reader of the text. To the churchmen, he was a godless atheist. To the Republicans, he was tainted with monarchy or monarchism. And to the monarchists, he was a dangerous skeptic and free thinker. Hobbes, again, along with Machiavelli, was one of the great architects of the modern state. And to some degree, he even seems even more characteristically modern than Machiavelli. I mean, consider just some of the following. Machiavelli speaks of the prince, while Hobbes speaks of the sovereign, that is, a kind of impersonal, or in Hobbes' language, artificial power created out of a contract. Hobbes' method seems scientific, it seems formal and analytical, in contrast to Machiavelli's combination of historical commentary and reflection drawn from personal experience. While Machiavelli often spoke of the sublime cruelty of men like Scipio and Hannibal, Hobbes speaks the more pedestrian language, the language of power politics, where the goal is not glory and honor, but self-preservation. And Machiavelli's emphasis upon arms is considerably attenuated by Hobbes' emphasis on laws. Hobbes, in other words, tried to render acceptable, tried to render palatable what Machiavelli had done by providing a more precise and more legal and institutional framework for the modern state. So let's think a little bit about what it was that Hobbes was attempting to accomplish. Hobbes, like Machiavelli, was an innovator, and he was self-consciously aware of his innovations. Again, like Machiavelli, who said in the 15th chapter of The Prince that he would be the first to examine the effectual truth of things, as opposed to the imaginings of them, Hobbes wrote that civil science, that's what he called political science, civil science, was no older than my book, De Cive. Modern political science, he said, began with this book of 1642. What did he think of as his novelty? What was new? What was revolutionary about, or innovative about Hobbes's political science? Hobbes clearly saw himself, in many respects, as founding a political science modeled along that of the early founders of the scientific revolution. Galileo, I already indicated that Hobbes had met, William Harvey, René Descartes, a handful of others who were part of what we think of as the modern scientific revolutionaries. And like these other revolutionaries who had overthrown, you might say, the Aristotelian paradigm in natural science, Hobbes set out to undermine the authority of Aristotle in civil science, in political and moral science. Hobbes sets himself up as the great anti-Aristotle, the great opposition to Aristotle. Consider just the following passage from Leviathan, with one of my favorite titles from the book, a chapter called Of Darkness from Vain Philosophy and Fabulous Traditions. In that chapter, chapter 46, Hobbes writes, "There is nothing so absurd that the old philosophers have not some of them maintained. And I believe that scarce anything could be more absurdly said in natural philosophy than that which is now called Aristotle's metaphysics, nor more repugnant to government than much that he hath said in his politics, nor more ignorantly than a great part of his ethics." So there you see Hobbes laying down a challenge. What was it that he claimed to find so absurd, repugnant, and ignorant in Aristotle? What was he trying to dethrone in Aristotle? Hobbes is typically concerned with the foundations of this new science, getting the building blocks right from the beginning. The opening chapters of Leviathan, which I've only assigned a few, but the opening chapters present a kind of political physics, where human beings are reduced to body, and the body is further reduced to so much matter and emotion. Human beings can be reduced to their movable parts, much like a machine. What is life, he asks, rhetorically in the introduction. What is life but a motion of the limbs? What is the heart but a spring? Or reason but a means of calculating pleasures and pains? He sets out to give a deliberately and thoroughly materialistic and non-teleological physics of human nature. In fact, a French disciple of Hobbes in the next century, a man named La Mettrie, wrote a treatise very much following in the lines of Hobbes called L'Homme Machine, or literally Man a Machine. This is the way Hobbes's new science of politics appears to begin. And that new beginning is intended to offer, in many ways, a comprehensive alternative to Aristotle's physics, or Aristotle's politics. Aristotle, remember, argues that all action is goal-directed, is goal-oriented. All actions aim at preservation or change, at making something better or preventing it from becoming worse. Hobbes believed, on the other hand, that the overriding human fact of the overriding motivation of human behavior is largely negative. Not the desire to do good, but the desire to avoid some evil. Aristotle, for Hobbes, had simply seen the world through the wrong end of the telescope. For Aristotle, human beings have a goal, or a telos, which is to live a life in community with others for the sake of human flourishing. But for Hobbes, we enter into society not in order to fulfill or perfect our rational nature, but rather to avoid the greatest evil, namely death or fear of death at the hands of others. Politics for him is less a matter of prudential decisions of better and worse than it is, you might say, an existential decision of choosing life or death. For Hobbes, in many ways, as for Machiavelli, it is the extreme situation of life and death, of chaos and war, that come to serve as the norm for politics and political decision-making. Fundamental alternative or challenge to Aristotle. And furthermore, Hobbes not only criticized, you might say, the foundations, the motivational and psychological foundations of Aristotle's theory of politics and human nature, he blamed the influence of Aristotle for much of the civil conflict of his age. Aristotle, who was increasingly being embraced by civic republicans in England of his time, had been brought up, according to Hobbes, on Aristotle's teaching that man is by nature a political animal. This was, again, the thesis of the classical republicans, according to which we are only fully human, or we only become fully human, when we are engaged in political